Hello, this will be part 7 in the series and the final history of Hermetic, and I'm only really dealing with a specific part in history, basically the 16th century up until the 18th century in this series. There's a lot more to it. It travels, across the world, across time. It's not directly here, but earlier episode talked about Robert Flood, the use of that particular picture, how his hands are arranged in a certain way, essentially flashing gang signs, and on the lower right corner we see Albrecht Dürer doing the same thing. So very important character in regards to, well, many aspects, geometry, the most. So he was 15th to early 16th century, but for instance, we see some examples of his geometry and some of the unconstructable geometric constructions. He's got some really good info on them, comes very close to them in a lot of cases. But he like with pretty much all these people featured, he was a polymath, so he was into many things. He wasn't just into geometry, he wasn't just into this, just into that. He was across the board. For instance, his work on drawing perspective was very influential in the time after, to create some of those really beautiful artworks, like Flemish masters and stuff who come after. But in his other, amongst his other works, for instance, his art imbued with lots and lots of symbolism, and again some really, really important stuff. Now his most famous one is the Melancholia 1 magic square, the compasses, all these things in there, but the proportions of it, again, which will connect to all these architectural series that I've done in all around the world, again creates this 7-11 ratio, or technically 14 to 11, but you see how it fits in, which again matches all these, for instance, Canada, the Louvre pyramid in Paris, and these of course not only linked to beautiful numbers like pi and phi, but also encode the size of the Earth in relation to the Moon. Now, there was an exhibit here recently, missed out on, unfortunately, but the rhinoceros was one of his pictures. Well, this brings us to the livery guilds in the city of London, not London metropolitan London, but the actual city of London, which is essentially the same as the Vatican. What the Vatican is to Rome, the city of London is to London. But the Apothecaries Guild, now you could just call it the early pharmacists. An apothecary was a farmer. But here's their shield: Apollo riding the dragon, the sun god Apollo with the arrow and the bow. And Apollo was the father of Asclepius, who was the Greek god of healing. So when you see a rod with one snake around it, very common on ambulances, doctors, when it's just one snake, that's the rod of Asclepius. Now, Apothecaries Hall, one of the livery guilds in London. Now, we'll get into the guilds in a moment, but once more, just as it's harder to see there, but the rhinoceros on top of Apollo, who's riding this dragon. You can really look. There's a lot of info available to this now. This is the Chelsea Garden, but it used to be called the Physic Garden, as in physician, or the doctor's garden, where they grew herbs. Now, it wasn't until, I think it was 1984 or 1983, it was still considered, it was off limits to the public. It's since been open, but for instance, this is the lab from the Apothecaries Guild. So essentially you could think of them, well, they were alchemists. They knew certain brews and how to extract, using the alchemical methods to make tinctures and distillation, all these type of things. Now, apothecaries' weight is also an important one, because back in 648, 1296, 388, anyway, beautiful numbers again, just so happens to match up with so much of this. But so we had the Troy ounce, which we measure silver and gold, apothecaries' weights, and avoir de part. We had these different systems. Different guilds, different professions would have their own particular weights and measures. So there's just a picture from the Chelsea Physic Garden, which is now a garden open to the public. And this is Hyde Park in Sydney, but if you're familiar with this, I'm sure that they had a couple of these growing there in the garden. But the livery hall. So what you had was trade guilds or craft guilds in the old, like especially from the 10th century onwards, even back when 1066 they were recorded, which were like early trade unions. So for instance, the bow makers was a guild, and bow makers knew their craft. The master would teach the apprentice. They also were a mutual aid organisation, so they would look after each other, almost like an early insurance schemes where everyone chips in. And the spectacle makers, or the oculists as well, that's another interesting one as well, in regards to lesser known secret societies as well. But it's like in England back to the 13th century, the word oddfellow was a term which would be to describe someone who was a member of a craft guild. Now, for instance, whether they were carpenters working with bricks or any one of these crafts, you would become an apprentice, then you'll become a master. Now they would also, to protect the quality of their work, amongst other things, and also to protect, so the carpenters would teach their skills in a secret way, so that someone wouldn't come along and put them out of business as well. So they operated very much like I think like a trade union sort of would. But the Oddfellows is now, or later become, an official mutual aid society. Many similarities with Freemasons in their symbolism, in their structure, in the way they operate as a mutual aid organisation. And it was for working men would come together and pool their money, and they would provide widows' pensions, scholarships, health insurance, credit. For instance, it was very hard. There was no. Now we just get on the phone, health insurance, get a credit card, do this, do that. It's all it's all very easy now. But back in the day, that was not available, and about the only way you could achieve these, get these basic services, medicine, was to join a craft guild. This is from Salzburg, and interesting because the shop fronts still carry these symbols. So much like craft guilds, shops, businesses would have certain symbols connected to them. Now here's an older work showing, essentially we see the Masonic tools, and so the Masons were also one of these craft guilds. This is how they emerged, because their craft was masonry. It was not like just open to all professions. Masons were, strictly speaking, stonemasons, and this was again another craft guild. Masters and apprentices, they would chip their money in together to have insurance schemes. If you went visiting, you would have a secret password where you would get free accommodation and protection, basic services as well. And so even old stained glass, you still see it. But this brings us to the constructions of the great cathedrals, and I'll do it with a focus on Chartres Cathedral because it's one of the most ones filled with knowledge and hidden meaning and so forth. So the stained glass in Chartres even commemorates the Masons who made them. Now, at the time of the great cathedrals, different bishops were competing with each, because there was a limited amount of workmen, so they would compete with each other to attract the workmen by giving them better working conditions. And the masons and the glass makers, for instance, were able to negotiate with the Lord and say, well, I'm not going to pay this church tax, I don't have to do this, I don't have to do that. And that was the rise of, Masons as we know them now, and also mutual aid organisations. They were able, because that work was so valuable, they were able to stand up to the church authorities and the local authorities, because, there was only so many of them, very important. Now, in regards to older symbols in trades and craft guilds, for instance, the barber surgeon. Now, barbers were also surgeons because they had the knives, they had the scissors, they had the scalpels. And so if you might have heard the term barber surgeon, that's why the stripes, that red and white stripe that you'll see connected to barbers, is the blood from bloodletting and these sort of and lancing boils. They did all of that before GPs and doctors, because that's relatively modern. Another symbol is with pawnbrokers, is the free hanging balls. Now, this was a symbol. Also, people weren't very literate, so you would have this symbol in front of your shop because you didn't write, pawnbroker or moneylend on the front because, people didn't read it. They used these types of symbols. And this was not just shopkeepers and these other service providers, but also the craft guilds, and the most famous of them, legacy, is the Masons. So here's an older picture of masons, stonemasons at work, and again we see this one. Now we compare it to a Freemasonic tracing board. Now, free and accepted Masons are from all professions. This is relatively recent, but earlier they were, strictly speaking, either tilers, bricklayers, stone cutters, or stone masons. And we see the compass and the square and the origin of it. Now, back to this picture again, with a tracing board and any second. So we see these tools highlighted by the Craft Guild, how they've evolved and become the mutual aid societies we know now. For instance, the level, the compass and the square, but and fraternal. Masons are a fraternal organisation or a brotherly organisation or a mutual aid organisation. Now, Odd Fellows and Masons used to provide these services for their members, especially from World War I to World War II. Very interesting history of how the lodge system was suppressed and become something else. But we still see it's still an important legacy of it. And the Odd Fellows and Masons still operate as mutual. You look after your brother, so to speak. And just some shots from a previous video, like how in the Missouri state capitol building, the cornerstone ceremony, and how this carries through. And so the Masons that built places like Chartres Cathedral, Reims, Beauvais, Strasbourg, and these other ones, they had to know geometry. They had to know these math skills to work out, how to do the proportions, how to do your arches and stuff. And so if we go back to Chartres and some of the portals there, so here we see the main one. I think this is the north. And anyway, another very, again, if you're familiar with earlier videos, and a lot of other people have discussed this type of thing. But and especially Chartres, like a lot, there's been excellent research, really gone in depth in regards to it. But a bit of a connection throughout this series is alchemy, and the stained glass, for instance, in Chartres, it's still a bit mystifying now how they're able to achieve certain properties and qualities within the glass, and even modern day industrial chemists, it's still a bit beyond them how it was able to achieve, and that these people did this. Over 800 years ago. It's just some cool stuff there. But the labyrinth is another one as well. 112 cogs around the outside now. Geber, 112 books in his famous collection on alchemy, but with a focus now, so the portal there, and we have the Christ figure emerging from the womb, from the vesica, from the fish, is another way to think about it, because if we do the vesica, you get this 265 to 153 proportion, the best whole number approximation of a square root of 3. Very important if you're working in construction. If you're doing this type of business, you need to know this. 153 fishes in John 21, in the net as well, and then there's another reference to this vesica being the net. But especially if you see Christian art still goes through to newly built churches, the four evangelists, or sometimes called the four horsemen, but they also form the four cardinal points of procession. And this again is another recurring theme in older architecture such as here, but even up into state capitals in the US. I did a long series on that. Here in Australia, Canada, everywhere really, and one of these things hidden in plain sight, and a set of astronomical knowledge which is very important. Now, for instance, one of the oldest recorded Oddfellow lodges was the Lodge of Aristarchus. He was a Greek astronomer who talked about the heliocentric model and of the precession of the equinoxes way back when. But on I think now if it's the north or the south, I'm not sure, but this is another portal to Chartres, and what we see is many figures, but to begin with, Pythagorean theorem, we'll look at that later, how important it is to the development of Freemasonry, and Euclid as well. So the geometry of Euclid, as well as the math and geometry of Pythagoras, it's standard stuff now, but another recurring thing are the 7 liberal arts. Now, I usually talk about the quadrivium: music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy, but we have all of the 7 because the trivium are also very important, but they're not weights and measures, so to speak, but they connect strongly to law and to debating and logic, all these type of things. So to get a full set, you need the hard knowledge of the quadrivium, but without the trivium, you cannot really express it, you cannot really analyze it. So it's a bit like we used to get taught comprehension in school, or there used to be proper debating. Now it's not like that anymore. You're sort of told what to think, and you don't want to trigger anyone by debating something which they deem offensive. Anyway, yeah. But anyway, quadrivium, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music being keys. Now, these also will connect through. A hermeticist cannot be a hermeticist without the trivium, without the quadrivium. And now we'll have a look at some of the works of Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit, but a very important, very influential hermeticist, historian. And amongst his works, he was prolific. Now, I don't think he did actually all the drawings, just like what usually happens, someone, the underling does the drawings, but we see many descriptions of music, of alchemy, of astronomy, also Egyptology. He was one of the early Egyptologists in that sense, and for instance, one of his manuscripts featuring Isis. And these now he was a Jesuit in that time, of that dark time, but yet he was still very much involved and dealing with ancient symbols. For instance, here we see columba, bottom corner of the eye, musical scales, the cornucopia in the top, as well as the bottom left was the acanthus as well, another reference there. And also he was dealing with some, straight for the time, way ahead of his time. You weren't not really supposed to talk about these certain things. It was basically because it didn't, anyway. But he also did some of his artworks. You can see proto tracing boards. I have all the features of your standard Masonic Oddfellow tracing boards. And so this stream of Hermetic knowledge through the Rosicrucians, etc. Now, that picture, and we'll see this one, not only do we have the caduceus, there's a few references there, the double-headed eagle, the peacock, also the Apollo and Artemis, the sun and the moon god. And here we see again the sun and the moon. The tetragrammaton and tetractys will also be recurring themes throughout these, and still are now. You'll still find them in, again, modern styles, but also hidden in plain sight in modern architecture. So, for instance, the first episode in this series was about the Elizabethan period. Well, Queen Elizabeth reigned up till 1603, and so again in that period of Robert Flood, and the previous he's right in that chunky part, but he was working on the mainland as opposed to England. But here we see comparison over Isis with the Sistrum, as well as Valir, but also Doric, Ionic, Lydian, Phrygian, Mixodylian, and Locrian. These musical scale, musical modes, and again how they connect. I've done more than enough in regards to the Doric and Ionic columns in Freemasonry, but how they're also ancient systems of measurement. And showed these two pictures earlier, but if we have a look, so we have a depiction of Artemis, of Apollo, and of the caduceus of Hermes, or Mercury, and these are all connected to Zeus and the Olympian gods, for instance, but they're also just essentially retellings of older other stories, other connections, because this even predates Greco-Roman period by a long shot. Now, here's we see again but also how Mithraic symbols, it appears in Mithras, and then how these were transferred into the Christian sphere. So you'll see like Mithras slaying the bull, Apollo, Artemis, the all-seeing eye, the sun and the moon, the tetragrammaton are all. I know some people would try and push it away, but it's just like it's all there. What can you do? And I did a while back. I did a video breaking this down, but we're going to have a breakdown of this particular image and how again this will connect to the whole method, and especially up to the modern day. So the stonemasons of the older time had to understand geometry, arithmetic to do, to work out how to proportion their things, how to do their, how do you calculate your arcs, and how do you calculate the thickness versus height, all that type of stuff. It's just like an engineer still to this day. the architects and engineers of the great cathedrals had to be masters in these skills to achieve what they did, apart from the stained glass and all the other beautiful little points in regards to that construction. But back to that board, so we see the 6/5, the pentagram, and the hexagon 6/5, which is a beautiful conversion point across so many ancient systems of measurement as well. But you'll also see it in all manner of tracing boards, emblematic symbols. For instance, in Masonic type organisations such as the Templars. Just one of these things that has been carried through and from centuries before Athanasius Kircher, before Albrecht Dürer, before all these. But again, so the Tetractys or the Tetragrammaton, always in there. Now, it's not always in the standard form, but there we see the 1, 2, 3, 4. We have all sorts of geometry emerging from there. Again, they just all connect different ways, but you have the same information in there. Again, the magic square, just like in Melancholia 1, which in itself is has again multiple references and connections across also dimensions and this particular system. So with these handful of these small symbols, it just encodes so much, and not in a airy-fairy way, but like also in a tangible way where you can, like literally the cathedrals, the temples were built on these methods. They're not just randomly stacked bricks in some random order because a guy just sketched something out in the dirt. No, it's a lot of technical knowledge goes into this, and so the Hermetic schools, which also incorporated spiritualist type, something what we'd call spiritual, because there are deeper, like moral lessons, all sorts of other lessons connected with these, with all these symbols and the rituals that are connected also to the cornerstone and again the tools of masonry. Look, it's ideal with weights and measures and this type of thing mostly, but that's just one layer of it. There is so much more, and again, unfortunately, things like alchemy have been just gets all poo-pooed on, and by people who essentially get their understanding of what alchemy is by watching Hollywood, or some sort of TV show or some fantasy novel, and we'll get that. That's not the way that it is, and that's not the way to look into these things. But so the magic square of 15 as well, how that brings us to get, for instance, 10 on the Tetractys. The triangular number, fourth triangular number is 10, and if you extend it down, the next one is 15. So they all point from one to the other, they all join in, but we have the hexagon and the pentagon. A pentagram or pentagon encodes the golden number, phi, in such a beautiful way. We're also getting the Pythagorean triangle, and from all the compass and square, so we get the square root of 2. Earlier I mentioned the vesica and the square root of 3, and the Euclid's 47th, or which is Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, is also one of the rituals as one moves up Freemason-like level. I think it's Master Mason. I'm not a Mason. I can't, I'm not sure. But again, so you'll see this, whether it's in cathedrals, in tracing boards and Hermetic artworks, and literally in Freemasonic symbol up into this day, because like free and accepted, you don't need to be a stonemason to be a mason now, but earlier in the craft guilds and the people learning, this was necessary for it. Now, again, Pythagorean theorem, geometric constructions such as the pentagon and the hexagon, which can all emerge from the vesica, and all these, the tools and the symbols, how they all connect through older legends, astronomical legends, and the legends how, for instance, Perseus and the Clash of the Titans actually forms a star chart. And so through this particular method, the Hermetic system was carried on, and it's done in just a beautiful, it's all there. It's in such a lovely way, and whether you approach it musically or through maths or through geometry or through astronomy, you come back to the same crucial points. And so I'm going to end this, like I could go on again for a long, long time in regards to this. I'm going to end this series here because I have other things on what need to want to do and want to have a look at. But at the very least, the more skeptical, modern mind, you can dismiss certain things as a relic of older, what's the nicest term for it? Religion or some sort of kooky tradition or whatever. However, when you actually examine the records and the legacy of these things, the importance of it firstly cannot be denied, which in itself I think is very, very sad that these folk who had so much they achieved the knowledge was passed on, but they rebirthed it and again gave it back to us in a way. They did it at a time when the Inquisition and other type of movements were really suppressing. Maths was considered almost like witchcraft, and same with geometry, and so that was one of the reasons for this secrecy throughout that time. There was also, as with the craft guilds, certain trades also wanted to protect their knowledge against being knocked off, or people doing undercutting them and those types of things. So it's never ever easy to say it is this or it's that, because there are many conflicting aspects and many other interests going on. Sometimes self-preservation, sometimes economic, protecting your job and protecting your trade and keeping your wages high. But also, but even of those craft guild, for instance, the Masons who made the great cathedral, it was self-interest, and that you could describe it as that which drove them to do what they, because they were in a position to bargain with the lords and the bishops. But whether it was intentional on their part or not, their legacy was what we now would call open, free society, freedom from church authority, the establishment of constitutional law, the parliamentary systems, like whether it's Senate and Congress in America or the bicameral systems here in Australia or England, were actually derived from the procedures which were used within these lodges and guilds. And so it's the knowledge in itself is not evil. The knowledge in itself is wonderful, but just like with any tool, just like with anything, it's how it's used that can be bad. So like a sword, you can be a tyrant with a sword and dominate people, but you could also use a sword to liberate people. The sword itself is not evil, it's the intention by which it is used. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this series. It maybe provoked some thought or changed an idea, maybe prompted you to have a look at things differently. Again, these is pretty much very quick, really just providing search terms through this and some keys. Hopefully you'll be able to have a look at it a little bit deeper yourself. So with that, enjoy, have a good one, and I'll leave you with some magpies.